Reverend Richard McBride, ELN's Distinguished Chaplain Emeritus.
I'm glad to see a good number of folks from the community because you've just seen the kind of conversation that happens in the university setting. Very thoughtful men and women, staff and students who give a great deal of attention to what they want to say and to say it clearly. So thanks to all of you for being here. I do not own a gun except a BB gun, and there aren't any BBs at home. My dad's 2 rifles went to my brother and my son. My son, however, is an Apache helicopter pilot, so if the family needs to balance out, he provides the balance. There are a number of points to take up, but let me just take up the notion of reasonable regulation. Our Second Amendment offers us declares for us that we have the right to bear arms. I think some people only hear that it says that. You may know that it also says in the beginning that there is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the Supreme Court in recent decisions has decided 5-4 that the individual right to bear arms is preeminent, whereas the community, the other 4 justices said this is a communal right that communities would form militias. There's still a debate going on. It's 5-4. We're not unanimous in our view about what this right means. But I want to point to what I believe are some reasonable regulations. One just addressed by one of the speakers is the loopholes that exist that certainly should be closed. Megan's question is just still ringing in my ears. Why would it be possible for a person who has a domestic order against them to be still able to go buy an assault rifle? This just seems absurd on its face, beyond what reasonableness would suggest is necessary. You know, Joe Biden is an interesting guy. And on the issue of magazine clips, when they were talking about whether we might restrict the magazine clip to 10 clips, he said, if you need more than 10 rounds to hunt, and some argue they hunt with that number of rounds, you shouldn't be hunting. If you can't get the deer in 3 shots, you shouldn't be hunting. You're an embarrassment. Well, that strikes me also as a reasonable regulation, that we would limit the size of the magazines that are available to sportsmen. It's not a perfect solution. None of these are perfect solutions, but if they can reduce the possibility of danger to other human beings, why don't we embrace them? The North Carolina legislature at the moment has a bill before it that would allow for guns to be on college campuses within the state university system. That wouldn't apply to ELN. We could still declare against it. But here's the reason why I think that is not a good idea, and it has to do with the impulsivity of youth. Those who study brain development tell us that the part of the brain that governs judgment isn't really fully wired until your mid-20s and late 20s. No wonder teenagers have trouble with impulse control. So if we had more guns available, as last night at Arizona State's fraternity party, rage simply reached for a gun. I don't want more guns surrounding our campus community, so when folks are enraged, they have that sort of weapon to reach for. There are reasonable limits on how much lethality we should have in our communities. I'll just stop with that.
Good evening. I came to Elon in 1978 and graduated in 1983. You can do the math. It's a good place to be. I began my service in law enforcement after graduation, first with the Burlington Police Department. Then I moved to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and am currently with the Town of Elon Police Department. In my 30 years in law enforcement service, I know there are people willing to commit violent crimes, and I know there's no single solution. I recognize there's a delicate balance between the right to own firearms, the regulation of firearms, and the banning of certain firearms. While this has caused strong responses on both sides, I know that anytime we come together, like we are tonight, to talk to one another and to listen to one another, we often find that we are not that far apart, which gets us closer to solutions. I would also like to say, take this time just to say I would encourage, particularly our students here, that you should consider public service, whether it be in the law enforcement arena or any of the branches of service. It's a wonderful way to give back. It's a wonderful way to help others, and it's a wonderful way to be part of solutions. I would also like to say, I hadn't planned to say this, but Megan, using up the time, I just want to tell you that I'm sorry you were victimized, and but I'm proud of you because you've taken steps already in your life, particularly tonight, to take back the parts that somebody tried to take away from you, the parts of your life. And I, for one, stand with you. I don't, I don't have all the answers. I don't know that we'll ever come to those, but you're one of the reasons I have chosen to serve in law enforcement. And I would just say that I think that, you do not deserve any shame. Do not be ashamed. Often these people that do these kind of crimes, they're the problem. They're the cowards. I'll use that strong term. So you're a very strong person, so we stand with you, and so I just wanted to take time to say that to you.
Hi, I'm Celo Faucette, and I'm a member of Burlington City Council, and I am a gun owner. I've been a gun owner for quite some time, and I'm proud of it. But there's a couple of issues I'd like to go back to that affects us here locally. And it's how firearms get in our community. Where do they come from? How can we stop it? How have firearms been passed down from one person to the next person? I think a lot of that has to be put into focus. The mental health issue has to be put into focus. How are people able to obtain guns when there is some type of mental illness that they have a record of some type of mental illness? I think, and I may be wrong with the chief, some HIPAA laws, government laws may require that you not release that information, whether they have mental illness or not. It's something that we have to look at. But guns are here, and again, I want to be here locally. I know we have a national problem, but how can we protect our citizens here? How can we stop the guns from flowing into Alamance County? We have people that go from Greensboro, Durham, Raleigh, that purchase guns on the street, bring them right back to Alamance County. That gun is sold down to the next person. Those are the issues that we have to face. How can we stop the gun violence in our communities? Burlington, Alamance County is 100-some thousand people. There may be a gun for every person in Alamance County. Who knows? We don't have enough law enforcement to go door to door to search homes to see who has guns legally and illegally. So by me being a gun owner, I really think that a responsible gun owner, I think most people that own firearms are responsible. The ones that commit the crimes are irresponsible. But I ask that the community look at all these aspects, know what we're going out there after. Again, with the mental illness, the funds have been cut for mental illness. That's a part of that I would like to see put in the gun permit portion of it. When you go obtain your gun permit, and it may be in there, I really don't know, but I'd like to see it in there. When you get your gun permit, take the fingerprint, so that fingerprint goes along with that gun permit. So there's a lot of options out there that we can put into place to gain some control of this. I call it an epidemic that's going around in our country with guns. But I've got all my guns are 3-shot guns, so I don't have anything with big banana clips or anything like that. Yeah, when I get through shooting my 3, I'm through, and reload. So, but I think that's what we have to look at. Is just how can we control guns in our neighborhood, and then go state and national. But this is my biggest concern. It's what's happening here to our citizens in Alamance County. Thank you.
I'm trying to see if I can reach this microphone. I'm a little bit hoarse. My name is Steve Ross. I'm a representative in the North Carolina General Assembly in Raleigh. First of all, I want to thank the university for the opportunity to be here to be a part of this panel tonight. Also want to commend the students and I think a couple of maybe faculty members for their comments that they made earlier. Very well thought out, and some of the statistics and some of the numbers that you talked about, you researched items sometimes much better than my colleagues in debate in the General Assembly, and my hat's off to you for that. But you touched on something that I think we really, the core issue of what's going on, and the term is violence. And I think we all recognize that society's gotten more violent. As I was looking at some of the statistics that we use in different pieces of legislation, trying to find ways to make society safer, if we can. I was looking at some of the numbers for 2010 for North Carolina. Overall violent deaths in North Carolina. And this is not gun deaths. This is just overall violent deaths. In 2010 were 1,790. That's a lot of violent deaths in North Carolina. Some of the numbers that struck me or stood out were the suicide numbers. The suicide numbers during that same period were 1,777, and that's just in North Carolina. And of course, homicide represented about 507. You've all touched on a lot of great issues as to why these things are going on, why it's happening. A lot of us are old enough, Chief Parker, to remember a time when you left your doors unlocked, your keys in your car, and that kind of thing. And I think we all recognize that times have changed, and that's not the case anymore. There are many, many, many factors that go into violence. You've touched on many of them here tonight. Drugs is a big issue. Prior to going to the General Assembly, I spent 16 years on the City Council and a couple of terms as mayor in Burlington. Worked closely with my police department on these very same issues. The drug traffic coming into Burlington, that generates some of the problem. Some of the domestic violence issues, I mean, that was on the increase, and trying to deal with that. One thing that is still troubling to me is the number of crimes committed against children in this country. And there are so many different ways that these things happen. You just have to ask yourself the question, what's going on in people's minds? You've mentioned mental illness. But I contend that there's some other things that are going on in society that are causing things to get a little bit more violent. Just in Raleigh last week, we had a high-profile homicide. It was done with a knife. So there are just so many issues that are involved in violence, and I think it's great to be able to open up a dialogue and talk about all of the issues, because I don't think you can pin the violence that's going on in society right now on any one thing. I think it's a multitude of things, and look forward to the dialogue.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I'm a professor at ELN Law School down in Greensboro, and I've been asked to discuss what the Constitution says about gun ownership. And as we heard earlier, the Second Amendment to the Constitution says, and I'll just read it all in full so we have it in our heads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And in two recent opinions, the Supreme Court has kind of outlined some things about that right and the extent of that right. The first is that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It's not a collective right. It's an individual right. It was a 5-4 decision, but 5 wins. So the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. The second is that this right arose from a historic right that individuals had to self-defense and to the right to resist tyranny. So that's the foundation, why we have the Second Amendment, is self-defense to resist tyranny. And the third thing I want to point out is that the right to keep and bear arms, like every other right enshrined in the Constitution, is not absolute. It is subject to limitations. Your right to free speech is subject to limitations. Your right to bear arms is subject to limitations. Your right to be free from searches and seizures is subject to limitations. And so the question boils down to what limitations are allowed. And the Supreme Court overturned in those 2 cases a flat ban on the ownership of handguns in the District of Columbia on the theory that that ban prevented people from being able to exercise their right of self-defense. And then in the second case, where they dealt with the Second Amendment, they overturned more creative legislation from the city of Chicago that essentially achieved the same end. So we know from that Supreme Court precedent that the government cannot restrict ownership of handguns, prevent ownership of handguns, because handguns are central to the right of self-defense. But they also suggested that many longstanding limitations on the keeping and bearing of arms remain valid, constitutional. So limitations on possession of firearms by felons, possession of firearms by the mentally ill, the carrying of guns in schools and government buildings, and any conditions and some conditions and qualifications on commercial gun sales. So where does that leave us? Well, it tells us that the Second Amendment does answer some questions, but it leaves a lot of them unanswered for us. It is not going to tell us what we as a society or what our legislators specifically can and cannot do. So certainly the government can't ban all guns. They can't take all guns away. That would violate the Second Amendment. But at the same time, it does seem to leave the door open to substantial regulation of the rights to keep and bear arms, so long as those regulations don't overburden your right to self-defense and your ability to resist tyranny with firearms. And that leaves a lot of space for legislative action and decisions to be made by society more generally, which of course is the subject of this whole discussion. But I guess I kind of wanted to make clear that the Constitution doesn't necessarily answer all of those questions. And then finally, one other comment that I'll pull from my experience as a criminal law professor is that we need to understand what criminal laws seek to do. Criminal laws don't seek to, or they seek to, but they never can, prevent all instances of criminal conduct. Murderers, people who are committed to committing murder, will always kill somebody if they have the opportunity. And so criminalizing murder doesn't achieve the end of wiping out murder. It's too bad. You know, we wish it could, but it can't. Rather, criminal laws seek to deter, and they seek also to shape societal norms. We criminalize murder in part to communicate to everybody that murder is wrong. And so when we talk about the potential of criminalizing things, we ought to keep in mind that the goal of criminalization is to wipe it out, but it can't do that. And so to argue against criminalization on the grounds that the conduct will still occur is not really that great of an argument. It misunderstands what the criminal law seeks to do. So if we're going to try to discuss the opportunity to criminalize things, we at least ought to understand how the criminal law works. It doesn't tell us criminalization is the right answer, but at least gives us some context. So thanks.
So at this time, before we go into the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that after this event is over, we're going to be having very informal reception over at Fireside Lounge so that these conversations and insights can continue. The panelists, both community and expert, will be there to answer any more questions that you have and talk through some things. And on behalf of the planning committee for this event, I want to take some time to thank the community panelists, thank the expert panelists for being here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out and being here and supporting this sort of conversation. So again, on behalf of the planning committee, I hope you've gained insight and a better understanding of the many issues, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of this event tonight. So I'll invite Dr. Book up here again to continue with the question and answer session.
So we have lots of questions, so that's good. These questions, I'm going to also open it up. There's a mic available to the speakers who provided, so that if you feel prompted, feel free to raise your hand and I'll recognize it's you as well. And what I'll do is read the question and then make available anyone who would like to respond to it to do so, and allow a couple of responses to the question and then move to the next so that we can hear many of these questions tonight. So the first one is related to the unemployment and the economics, and we actually had two related to this, and so I'll read them. If unemployment stays at 7% or more for the next 6 or 8 years, and people become more needy and desperate, law-abiding citizens will have to protect themselves, needing guns, correct? And then the other one is, do you agree that poverty could be a core issue across the United States and that it relates to the lack of mental health care, gang violence, and gun misuse? If so, what should be done to solve this core issue? So those are kind of related about economics and how does that play into the issue of gun violence?
Is that just open for anyone?
Yeah, anyone
All
who'd
right.
like to jump in.
Well, in my day job, or my job outside the General Assembly, I work in financial services and with economics, and it is a proven fact that in economic tough times, you can go back and look at recessions, for example, prolonged recessions. Criminal activity goes up. We know that locally. We can see the statistics, and we also know that that takes place nationally. So anything that we can do to lower unemployment, foster better working conditions, obviously will have an impact on the statistics.
Another question. What are state legislators doing to enforce stricter punishment for felons with firearms? My uncle was murdered by a felon with a firearm.
I guess I'll have to take that one. We have reached a point now in the General Assembly this year where we're in excess of about 1,100 bills just on the House side that have been introduced. A good number of these pieces of legislation, some have already passed, are increasing penalties, making some misdemeanors have become felonies. I mean, we're really trying to tighten laws where laws need to be tightened in criminal activity to try to again, make things safer. I'll go to domestic violence. One of the bills that I was involved in this morning in Judiciary we had a debate on a bill on the protective orders that we know don't work. Yet they're given out all the time. Judges use protective orders, and that's their way of saying, okay, I think, you're going to be safe. We know it doesn't work. So one of the pieces of legislation that's being debated right now is one that requires GPS tracking devices on those that have these orders placed on them. In other words, for example, if someone committed a piece of domestic violence against, say, their spouse, and the judge ordered them not to, for whatever reason, come within a certain perimeter of that person, we know from past experience and statistics that it just doesn't work. And when law enforcement is called, typically it's that person's word against the other. However, the GPS device, and I can't tell you how it works. It's technology. It's over my head. But the example that was given to us this morning in the judiciary was that this device will trigger an alarm not only for law enforcement, but an alarm for the victim should that person come within a certain range of the individual. Is that going to solve all the problem? No. There's still going to be problems. There are going to be people, even with the tracking device on, that are going to go, into the forbidden zone. But it's a step in the right direction. It's a step, trying to work with the issue, recognizing it's a problem, knowing protective orders don't necessarily work. It's a step in the right direction to try to protect the individual that needs the protection from the protective order. So there are a number of different issues that we're debating right now, as well as increasing some of the penalties, misdemeanors to felonies. It's a long process. It's never going to make us totally safe, but we just keep trying.
Another question. Please address the anti-gun regulation position in light of suicide. Of the more than 30,000 gun deaths each year, 20,000 are suicides, and of these, most of the guns are obtained in the home. Would not more regulations stem this tide? I'd actually like the chief to answer this, because I know you're often called as a police officer to the scene of a suicide, and just curious what your thoughts are on.
Well, I think you're dealing with a person that has come to the level that they're prepared to take their own life. I think we're dealing with issues outside of just the firearm issue, because we've seen, over my career, I've seen, unfortunately, other methods than firearms. It is a high percentage, and that's that balance we talk about between a firearm that is legally owned and possessed, and then is, in some cases, used by the person that legally possessed it against themselves. And and at the time a firearm was purchased or was available, the person themselves or the person in the home may not have been in that state of mind. So I don't know if there is an easy answer about regulating firearms in light of suicide, because there's not always a predictive measure about what's going to happen with the firearm, what a person chooses to do, where they are in that stage of life.
Okay, another question. For 2,000 years, and I'm going to try to read this handwriting. Strong men ruled the world with swords. When the Chinese invented gunpowder, it changed this forever. Now, an 80-year-old grandmother can live alone and defend herself with a firearm, not with a sword. Should you go back to swords, or should we continue to allow Granny to be able to stand up for herself?
I think Granny has a right to stand up for herself. If she's able to use it, then go for it, Granny.
Well, it's an interesting question about